Welcome everyone to another week and a new Sefer of Ramban ala Parsha. We have the zchus to begin reading Sefer Bamidbar this week, and as is our custom and as is the Ramban's custom, there's an introduction to Sefer Bamidbar that's going to talk about, as the Ramban normally does, finding a theme of the Sefer and then specific points about the relationship between the Mishkan and Har Sinai and the need to guard it, etc., etc. Then we're going to spend some time talking about counting and why it's asur, and really the unique but very, very compelling shita of the Ramban about what exactly is asur and what not. I can tell you now that the Ramban doesn't think that saying Hoshia Esamecha to get to a minyan in shul is asur. I think he thinks there's a need to that. And finally, if we have time, a Ramban on why Shevet Levi was the opposite of populous. I don't know the word in English. There's just not that many of them, and it stands out. You know, the smallest Shevet is 20-something thousand, you know, and then Shevet Levi is like 8,000 or something like that. And so Ramban's going to talk about that as well. But let's start with the very beginning, the introduction of the Ramban to Sefer Bamidbar. Says the Ramban, Achar shebier Torah hakarbonot b'Sefer Ashlishi. Right after Sefer Vayikra tells us all about karbonos, hitchil ata l'sader b'Sefer hazeh ha-mitzvot shenitztavu binyan Ohel Moed. This Sefer is going to focus on the commandments that HaKadosh Baruch Hu gave Moshe in Ohel Moed. Ukvar he's here al tumat mikdash v'kadashav l'dorot. It's true, some of that already slipped into Sefer Vayikra. Ata yagbilet ha-mishkan. Now we're going to delineate the borders of the Mishkan. Why? Bihiyoto Bamidbar, ka'asher higbil Har Sinai, bihiyot hakavod sham. The Ramban, who thinks, as he thought back in Shmos, that the Mishkan is a zecher to Maimon Har Sinai, so he's going to see all these parallels. Sham v'tziva v'hazar akarev yumat kasher amar sham ki sakol yisakel. Right? Why hazar akarev yumat here? Because the Torah already said that if you go on the mountain, sakol yisakel. V'tziva v'lo yavo lirot kivalat hakodesh v'meitu. You can't look at the kelim of the Beis Hamikdash. Kasher yizhir sham pen yersu al Hashem lirot v'nafal mimenu rav. Same exact parallel to the end of Sefer Shmos. V'tziva u'shmartem et mishmeres hakodesh v'et mishmeret hamizbeach kasher amar sham v'gam ha'kohanim ha'nigashim al Hashem yitkadashu v'ha'kohanim v'am etc. etc. V'hinei tziva eich tihiyeh mishmeret hamishkan v'kelav. How is it that you're supposed to guard the Mishkan and its kelim? Eich tihiyeh mishmeret hamishkan v'kelav v'eich yachanu saviv v'yamod ha'am meirachok v'ha'kohanim ha'nigashim al Hashem eich yitnahagu bo. All of the same rules that God gave us in the end of Sefer Shmos about how we're supposed to stand and how close we're allowed to get with respect to Maimon Har Sinai, the same exact halachos apply to the Mishkan. And the point is, Bnei Yisrael is supposed to know that the Mishkan is the new Maimon Har Sinai. It's, as the Ramban says at the end of Shmos, it's the Gilui Shechina bin Nistar. Right? The relationship we have with the Mishkan is exactly the same as supposed to have with Har Sinai, with the Gilui Shechina on Har Sinai, which is, okay, that's a one-shot deal. Now we're going to recreate it in the Mishkan. Kimosha now, v'hakol malal mikdash v'kavod, Kimosha amru, Eino dome paltrin shel melach sheyesh lo shomrin, lepaltrin she'ein lo shomrin. Right? When you go to England and you go to Buckingham Palace, so there's these guys outside, the beef eaters, you know, with the hats and all these things. Now, are they going to stop terrorists? Are they there to stop terrorists? No. They're there to give honor to, you know, to King Charles, to the royal family, to the idea that if there are guards there, we know that there's something significant behind the guards. There wouldn't be guards if it wasn't significant. Says HaKadosh Baruch Hu, same thing. We're going to put Leviim around the Beis Hamikdash. We're going to put Leviim around the Mishkan. Are we afraid that someone's going to steal something from the Mishkan? No, that's not what we're afraid of. But eino dome paltrin sheyesh lo shomrin, lepaltrin she'ein lo shomrin. It's a sign of respect, and so therefore we're going to do it. Now the Ramban continues with a new idea. V'hasefer hazeh kulo b'mitzvot sha'a shenitztavu b'hem ba'amdam bamidbar. Most of Sefer Bamidbar, says the Ramban, are things that God commanded us in Ohel Moed in the Midbar. Uvenisim hanasu lahem l'saper kol ma'aseh Hashem asher asay mohem lafli, and the great wonders that God did for Klal Yisrael. V'siper ki heichel lateit oivehem lifnehem lacharev. Right, some of the narrative in Sefer Bamidbar is to make it clear that God did miracles for us. V'tziva eich techalek ha'aretz lahem. A lot of Bamidbar is about the preparation to enter Eretz Yisrael. And now the Ramban says something interesting, and it may not be precise. Ve'ein b'sefer hazeh mitzvot no hagot lidorot. Right? There are no mitzvos, says the Ramban, in Bamidbar that are noeg lidorot. Zulati k'tzat mitzvot b'inyanei ha'karbanot she'idchil bohen b'sefer ha'kohanim v'lo nishlam b'yirum sham. V'yishliman b'sefer hazeh. There's some things that were started in Vayikra that need to be repeated in Bamidbar. But the truth is, there's a handful of them. All the Achronim point out. Birchas Kohanim, it doesn't seem like it's a mitzvah tluya ba'aretz. Chala, tzitzis, pidyon b'chorim, nachalos. They're all in Sefer Bamidbar. So it could be that what the Ramban really means to say is that if there's a mitzvah in Sefer Bamidbar, there's a reason why it's going to be noeg immediately, right? You don't have to wait for Birchas Kohanim to be noeg. You don't have to wait for Sheva Shachalku and Sheva Shakivshu. You don't have to wait any amount of time. Chala is going to be noeg right away. Tzitzis is going to be noeg right away. Okay? So that's a possible explanation for the Ramban's seemingly difficult, position that there are no mitzvahs lidoros in Bamidbar, when in fact there are plenty of mitzvahs lidoros. But it could very well be that there are mitzvah lidoros that applied immediately when God gave it in Sefer Bamidbar. You didn't have to wait for Knisa La'aretz, or maybe you did have to wait for Knisa La'aretz, but it was immediately upon Knisa La'aretz, not having to wait any other period of time once they came into Eretz Yisrael. Okay? So that's the introduction of the Ramban to Bamidbar. The main point being that the Mishkan is like Maimad Har Sinai. That's a point we've seen before, but the Ramban fleshes it out here. Tons of parallels between the two. Therefore, you have guards for the Mishkan, because guards are a sign of respect, and if you have guards, people know that what's behind the guards is significant and valuable and something that should be respected. And then the last piece of the Ramban that, well, they said, that all of Bamidbar is not mitzvos lidoros. As we come across them one at a time, we'll have to discuss why that is. But I think the simplest answer is they're mitzvos that were noheg immediately upon Knisa La'aretz, and therefore they were given in Bamidbar, which is in preparation for Knisa La'aretz. Okay, that's the intro. Now, let's start with the psukim. So the beginning of the Sefer says, "Vayidara Hashem Moshe b'midbar Sinai ba'ol moed be'achad la'chodesh hasheni b'ashana hashenit l'tzeitam me'eretz Yisrael lemor." Su'u et rosh kol adat b'nei Yisrael l'mishpachotam leveit avotam. Right, Bamidbar is called Numbers, and it's called Numbers not because the whole Sefer. There are 2 counts in this week's parasha, and it carries over into Naso, into next week's parasha, and then in Pinchas there's another count. Okay, but as a theme, why not? B'mispar shemot kol zachol legul gelotam. Mi ben esrim shana v'mala kol yotzei tzava b'Yisrael tifkedu otam l'tzivotam atava aharon. Okay, you start counting them from 20 years and up. Says the Ramban, kol yotzei tzava b'Yisrael. So first he quotes Rashi. Magid she'ein yotzei l'tzava pachot mi ben esrim shana. The minimum age to be in the army is 20 years. Su at rosh kaladat b'nei Yisrael k'mo shamrim l'kostener amrim reishei didain. Right, raise up his head. That's what it means to count. Okay, says the Ramban. Ve'efshar she'yihiyeh hatam b'zeh ba'avur she'eino chazak lemilchama b'pachos me'esrim. Says the Ramban, it could be that you need to be physically mature. You need to be strong enough, and that only happens when you're 20. Ukimo shamru ben esrim lirdof. That's the time that you have the power and the strength to chase people. Aval, this is an unbelievable idea. Yitachen sheyeh perush kol yotzei tzava, kol hayotzim lehakel lihikahel ba'eda. When it says kol yotzei tzava, it means people who are of an age where they join in the communal meetings. Ki haneharim lo yikalu b'toch ha'am. Ki kol asefat am tikrat tzava. It says the Ramban, when the Torah uses the word tzava, it doesn't necessarily mean an army. It means kol yotzei tzava. When I was a kid, I remember this. The grown-ups would gather sometimes to talk about important issues outside of shul. And you knew not to walk over there, because if you did, they'd stop talking, or they'd look at you and say, what do you do? What's he doing here? This is a grown-up conversation. So says the Ramban, when you're less than 20, you're not a yotzei tzava. You don't feel comfortable hanging out with the grown-ups. You don't feel comfortable, discussing the issues, the important issues in the community and whatever, and they don't want you. And so, but when you turn 20, you are yotzei tzava, not just that you can go out to the army, but you can be part in a social way. You can be part of the social network that shuls basically function under, that schools function under, that communities function under. And there's a lot of truth to this. I really, really think there's a lot of truth to this. Okay, that's one small thing in the Ramban. Now we come to the main Ramban on this whole purpose. As you read the psukim in the Parsha, you're feeling, and certainly when you read the Rashis, that counting Klal Yisrael is the greatest thing ever. God moneotam mishum chibatam. God loves them, so He counts them. So where did this whole idea come from that it's prohibited to count Bnei Yisrael? That is the halacha, by the way. Let's be clear, right? I'm not just making that up. It's not just a medrash. It's prohibited to count Klal Yisrael. But why? What's wrong with it? What's bad about counting? It's true. Ki tisad rosh Bnei Yisrael v'kudehem v'natanu ish kofer nafsho l'Hashem b'vkodotam v'lo yihiyeh bahem negef b'vkodotam. Right? If you count them, there might be a plague. But if you don't count them, there won't be. And there once was a plague. David HaMelech made this mistake, and he counted Klal Yisrael, and God punished him and brought a plague. So how do we understand this? So says the Ramban, Tifkedu otam. This is still Pasuk Gimel of Perek Aleph of Bamidbar. But it's an amazing Ramban. First he says a separate point. Inyan pikida zikaron v'hashgacha al davar. When the Torah uses the word tifkedu otam, lifkod otam, pakod yifkod, it means to pay close attention, to put your full concentration on the person. Kilashon v'Hashem pakad et Sarah kasher amar. He didn't count Sarah, he remembered Sarah. He thought of her favorably. He put his focus on her. V'hu pitrono b'chol makom lo yimaleit mehen ish. Says the Ramban, this is pshat every single time that the Torah uses the shoresh pei kuf dalid. It's always a pshat al da'ati. V'gam pikadon, says the Ramban, when you give collateral, when you give something to a shomer chinim, to a shomer sachar, right? Gam pikadon mipnei sheshmirato v'hashgacha alav. It's called a pikadon because the shomer has to focus on it. V'kasher tziva limnot et Yisrael yomar tifkedu otam lirmoz shalo yispareim rak sheyitnu kofer nafsham machatzit hashekel uvahem yashkiach v'yedam mispar ha'am. Right? So you're not supposed to count them directly. You're supposed to count them through some intermediary. The one that we most know in the Torah is machzis hashekel. And then at the end, you'll count up the shkalim and you'll know how many people there are. Ve'amar b'David mispar mifkad ha'am. The same verb. Ki yada misparam b'pekidat hakofer. Because you'll know how many they are when you count the intermediary thing that they gave in. Ki rachoku etzli shalo yizaher David b'ma shamar katuv v'lo yebam negef v'vkodotam. How could David HaMelech, who was a tzaddik and loved HaKadosh Baruch Hu, how could he have made this mistake to count Bnei Israel directly if the halacha is you have to count them through some intermediary? V'imulai ta'a David, okay, and let's say David HaMelech really made a mistake. He really didn't know. Lama lo asa Yoav shkalim v'hayad davar HaMelech nitav etzlo. Yoav knew in the story at the end of Shmuel bet, right? Yoav knows it's a bad thing, and he tells David HaMelech this is a bad thing. So why didn't Yoav, says the Ramban, just use machzis hashekel? Okay, David told him to count Bnei Yisrael, and let's assume for a second, even though the Ramban is bothered by this, but let's assume that David really meant that. Okay, so Yoav decided on an intermediate step so that there wouldn't be a plague. V'amarlo, the pasuk says, Lama yivakesh zot Adoni, Lama yihiyeh la'ashma liYisrael. Why do you want to do this, David HaMelech? Why do you want to bring shame to Bnei Yisrael? It's asur. V'lama, so says the Ramban, V'lama lo yimneim bashkalim shalo yachata. So why didn't Yoav just step in and introduce the idea of shkalim so that the people, so it wouldn't be a sin? Aval kfi da'ati, says the Ramban, no. What I think is, Haya haketzef alav, here's the main line. Ba'avur shemina'am shelo litzorech. Says the Ramban, the sin was not that he counted Bnei Yisrael without shkalim. The sin was, there was no benefit, there was no need for David HaMelech to count Bnei Yisrael. David HaMelech counted Bnei Yisrael as an exercise in ego. It was a failing of his. Ki lo haya yotzei lamilchama. No one was going to war. V'lo oseh bahem davar be'etahi. No one was doing anything that you needed to account for. Rak lissameach libo shamelech al amrav. Just to make David, in his old age, feel good that he has this many subjects. He's the king over this many people. It's like when a rich guy literally counts his money. So it's embarrassing, but he wants to feel good. Every additional number makes him feel good. So says the Ramban, there was no need for this. It's an exercise in David HaMelech's ego. V'hu ma'amar Yoav v'yosef Hashem Elokecha ala'am kahem v'kahem me'apamim v'adoni HaMelech lama chavetz b'davar hazeh. God should grant you 100 times how many subjects you have now. But why count them? Okay, so that's a significant point here. So the Ramban, the chiddush of the Ramban is that the prohibition is not counting people. The prohibition is counting people for no reason. Okay, so I'm not saying the Ramban is accepted lahalacha, although, right, in shul people still try not to count, right? They hoshia samecha, they do all different things to get avani brov chastcha avo beitecha l'shtach, right? 10-word psukim, there are a few of them. Okay, the Ramban probably would say that that's okay, I think, because there's a purpose, there's a benefit. I need to know if there's a minyan or not. But the Ramban says, without a purpose, you're not allowed to do it, and that was the sin of David HaMelech. He did it for no reason. The benefit of the Ramban, just as an aside, is that, let's say in the state of Israel, there's a census. There's a real need. You need to know how many people there are in Israel. All governments need to have this basic information. You need to know how many people there are in Haifa and in Tel Aviv and Yerushalayim. You need to know, how do you give services to your to the members of your democracy if you don't know the numbers. So the Ramban would say, and a lot of people in Israel are somech on this, I think the Haredim still put up a fuss, but you're not counting heads. First of all, you're counting names. You're counting families. Second of all, there's a need. There's a real need. And so therefore you should be able to do it. The state of Israel does have sensai, I suppose, is the plural word for it. And it's a valuable thing. Okay, now the Ramban's going to suggest something else. V'ra'iti b'minbar Sinai Rabbah, Rabbi Elazar b'shem Rabbi Yossi ben Zimra Amar, kol zman shenimnu Yisrael litzorech lo chisru. When Bnei Yisrael were counted for a reason, nothing bad happened to them. Shelo litzorech chisru. When they count for no reason, then it makes sense in a way that the response to account for no reason is a plague. You can see HaKadosh Baruch Hu saying, you're going to be prideful over the fact that you have 1 million, 2 million, 3 million subjects. You're going to have fewer. After the plague's over, you're not going to have that many subjects, right? It's a direct response to. Eizezman nimnu litzarach. When will we count it for the reasons? Bimei Moshe u'bidgalim. This week's parsha, Bamidbar. That was a count that was necessary. U'bechiluk haaretz. When we have to divide the land up. Shelo litzarach bimei David. Okay, so that's the basic Ramban. Now he has another thought. V'yitachenod, another possibility, he says, Shenifaresh v'nomar, ki David siva limnot kol ish Yisrael, ritzono lomar, mi ben 13 shana v'mala shehu ish. Suggests the Ramban that the problem, the sin of David HaMelech, was not that he counted the Jews from 20 and up, which is what the Torah commanded. He's counting post-bar mitzvah boys. Ki lo nizkar b'minyano mi ben esrim shana v'mal. It doesn't say any place 20 years. Aval amar lechus sifruat Yisrael ve'edad misparam v'zeh haya onsho. Ki hakatuv lo hirsha limnot rak mi ben esrim shana v'mal b'shkalim u'mipnei shezeh inenu mefurash b'hakatuv ta'abo. Okay, it's not specific explicitly in the pasuk, so he made a mistake. He chashav b'ma shamar v'lo yebam negev shehu b'shkalim shehu kofer lahem aval Yoav natan libo v'chashash ledavar. Okay, so David HaMelech counted from 13, and that was his sin. Yoav was concerned about what might happen afterwards in the plague. David HaMelech was less concerned about that, and David HaMelech sinned. Okay, as it happens, it's really fascinating that David HaMelech sins, and then God, G-O-D, sends God, G-A-D, the Navi of David HaMelech, to David HaMelech to say to him, you sinned terribly. I'm going to give you 3 choices for what your punishment should be, right? And the pasuk we say at the beginning of Tachnun every day is not part of Tachnun. Vayomer David al Gad sar li ma'od. I feel terrible about what I did. Nipla na v'yad Hashem. I choose to fall into God's hands. Really, I choose that the Magefa comes. Ki rabim rachamav uv'yad adam ala pola. David says, I'll take my chances with God. I have a good track record of admitting my mistakes with HaKadosh Baruch Hu and God forgiving me. And, to a certain extent, that's really true. David HaMelech made a number of significant mistakes in his life. And I think the greatness of David HaMelech is that unlike Shaul and unlike other kings, he immediately recognized when he made a mistake, right? In this story, for example, David HaMelech immediately realizes he made a mistake. And he begs God for mercy. And ultimately, before God destroys Yerushalayim, David begs for a last time, and God does have mercy on him. And then the end of the story is they both go to Goren Aravna. They build a Mizbeach there. David buys the land. Goren Aravna, of course, being Har HaBayis. David HaMelech buys the land, and that becomes the Makom HaMikdash, which could lead to a Dvar Torah, which I would love very much to say, about how the power of tshuva is what gets us to the Makom HaMikdash, but that's for a different time and a different Dvar Torah. Okay, let's do one more Ramban. And this is the Ramban that I mentioned up front about the small numbers of Shevet Levi. Okay, we're in Perek Gimel, Pasuk Yudalid. Says the Torah, Vayidaber Hashem al Moshe b'Midbar Sinai lemor, Pikod et b'nei Levi leveit avotam lemishpachotam, kol zachar miben chodesh v'mala tifkidem. It's not that you can't count Shevet Levi, you can. But you have to do it separately. Okay? And they do it by families. Okay, and then there's the total number. Now we come to the Ramban. Vayidaber Hashem al Moshe b'Midbar Sinai, says the Ramban, Ba'avur shehizkir biyom diber Hashem et Moshe bahar Sinai chazar va'amar ki lo hayta tzava'at ha'pikida shel haLevim bahar Sinai. Just a detail, says the Ramban. The Torah is making clear that the commandment to count the Levim did not happen at Har Sinai. Ki b'chirat toldot b'nei Aharon levadam hayta bahar Sinai. The choosing of Aaron happened at Har Sinai. B'yom tzavato al ma'aseh ha'mishkan. Aval haLeviyim lo nitztaveh b'bechiratam b'Har Sinai rak b'Midbar Sinai b'Ol Moed. But the choosing of the Leviyim took place after Ma'amad Har Sinai, not at Har Sinai, rather at Ohel Moed. Kimo ha'mitzvot ha'nizkeret b'vnei Yisrael, like other mitzvahs in this sefer. Okay, now here's the point. V'hinei lo hayu shevet haLevim kishar hashvatim. The Levim were not the same as other shvatim. Ki mi ben chodesh v'mala lo hayu rak esrim u'shnayim alef. There were only 22,000 of them. I think Shimon had in the 70,000s. Right? How could there be so few? Umi ben shloshim shana kulam shmonat alafim. There's 8,000. V'hinei lo yagiu mi ben esrim shana v'mala lechatzi shevet mi Yisrael hapachot shebekulam. Even though you're counting from 30 days and up, the 20-year-old Leviim, the total number of them doesn't get to half the size of another shevet, of the smallest other shevet. And the Ramban says, I know what you're going to say, because it's out there in the Medrash. Well, the people who have to deal with the Beis HaMikdash and the Kalim and stuff like that, right, bad things happen to them. It's dangerous. It's like Uzzah when he's bringing the Aron to Yerushalayim, right, and God strikes him down. But says the Ramban, Va'adayin lo nasu ha'aron shetiyah kedusha mechaleh bahem. But that can't be the case. Maybe later on it could be the case. But he said right now, no one carried the Aron any place. How could the fact that they have to carry the Aron be what's killing them? V'zeh tmiyah. This is a big wonder, says Ramban. Eich lo yihiyu avodah v'chasidah b'ruchei Hashem. Shouldn't the chosen of God, Shevet Levi, shouldn't they be blessed in number? Kishar kol ha'am? So says the Ramban. Va'ani choshev shezeh chizuk l'ma she'amu rabotenu. He thinks this is a significant point within Chazal. Ki shivto shel Levi lo hayu b'shibud meleches Mitzrayim u'vavodas parach. Says the Ramban, no. I think this has to do with the fact that Shevet Levi weren't slaves. Moshe wasn't a slave, Aaron wasn't a slave, Miriam wasn't a slave. Shevet Levi was not part of the Avodat Parach. V'hinei Yisrael asher meriru hamitzrim et chayehem ba'avodah kasha. The regular Jewish people who were tortured by the Egyptians, kidei lema'atam haya kadosh baruch hu marbeotam kineged gzerat Mitzrayim, kimosh amar v'cha asher yanu oto ken yibeh v'chein yifrotz. The people who were afflicted, so God blessed them in particular to show Egypt. You think you're going to, lower the numbers of Jews? They're going to have tons of children. The response was the people became more. Can't think of the word. The people became more numerous. Ki aya kadosh baruch hu omer nired dvar mi yakum mimeni o mehem. God said, let's see who's right, the Egyptians or me. Obviously, God is going to be right. Aval shevet Levi ayu parim v'rabim kiderech kol haaretz. If you want to look at how the numbers should have been, you look at Shevet Levi. They had children in a regular way. They didn't have shisha b'keres echad. They had regular children. V'lo alu l'mala kisha shvatim. They didn't get crazy numbers like the other shvatim. V'ulai hayazeh mikas hazakein alehem. It could be anger at them. Ki Shimon shahu achshav merubeh b'uchlusin nisma'et b'knisato la'eretz la'esrim u'shnaim alef. Right? It could be that tribes like Shimon that had been really, really populous at the beginning of Sefer Bamidbar, in the second year of the Midbar, by the time they actually went into Eretz Yisrael, they were decimated. Okay, that could be because of sin. V'levi shehu shevet chasidav lo nitma'et b'magefa. And on the other hand, Levi starts to catch up, because Levi didn't sin. Levi's not going to be killed in a magefa like Shimon was, and therefore the numbers are going to work out. When Yaakov Avinu, the Zakein, criticized them or cursed them, right? Shimon v'Levi klei chamas mecharotehem b'sodom al tavon nafshi, etc., etc., that caught up with them. But Shevet Levi, who also was not a recipient of the brachos of Yaakov, but somehow, and that's for a different discussion, but how Shevet Levi went from one of the the disliked shvatim to the greatest Shevet ever is a discussion and an analysis we have to do separately. But the bottom line is they were never subject to a plague, so eventually their numbers started to look like the numbers of other shvatim. But originally there was no reason to make them unnaturally large, because they had not suffered under the cruel rule of Mitzrayim. Okay, so we did the introduction to Bamidbar, which was difficult but useful. We talked about the counting and the Ramban's unique shita, that counting for no reason is asur, counting for a reason is asur, and we talked about why Shevet Levi, despite the fact that they were the chosen of all the shvatim, were the smallest of the shvatim until later on. Yashkach to everybody, Shabbat Shalom, and see you next week.